me, Alexander Chuk, and Angela Daly, we jointly co-direct Strathclyde Center for Internet Law and Policy. And it's our pleasure to welcome to our monthly webinar, Damien Geradin, who is known in many capacities. He is an academic, he is also a practitioner, he is a co-editor of one of the most appealing and most influential journals in the area of competition law and economics and beyond. And today we have agreed to discuss the issues related to Digital Markets Act, part of the Digital Services Act package. And thank you very much, Damien, for your availability. And we look forward to listen to your ideas and to discuss with you this really appealing proposal.
Well, thank you so much, Olesh and Angela. I'm delighted to be among this group today. I haven't prepared any slides because my intention is not necessarily to quote provisions of the DMA proposal or to go into the details of some parts of that proposal. I think what I would like to do today is perhaps to give you more the view of someone who has been battling Google, Apple, and others for many years. First, before the European Commission, then some national competition authorities and courts. I'm also someone who's been following the genesis of the DMA proposal since its start. And so I think my views will be more of a broader nature rather than an approach that is extremely granular. So first of all, a few words about the origin of the DMA. So I think that the origin of the DMA, or the main reason why there is this proposal, is probably because there is a consensus that you can find in many reports that were commissioned in the past few years that competition law has some shortcomings when it is applied in the digital sector. It's a slow instrument. It takes many years for competition authorities to carry out their investigations. Very often the remedies were found not to be very satisfactory. The cases tend to be narrow and therefore will perhaps bring a solution to the very specific facts at play, but no general solution to a given problem. And of course, the Google cases have been considered as the perfect examples of the limitations of competition law because nobody's really happy with the outcome. I don't think Google is terribly happy with the outcome, and the complainants and a variety of other firms that are affected by these practices are not happy either. But there are reasons why competition law investigations take a lot of time. These cases are complex, and then competition authorities have to go through the motions. They have to engage in market definition, dominance analysis, an FX-based analysis, which is of course something that became compulsory, since the turn of this century. And then these decisions are subject to strict judicial review, which makes the Commission and also competition authorities generally quite careful about their case, and they will try to make the case as strong as possible. And obviously that takes time, and this creates delays. But also it leads the Commission to pursue very narrow cases. It's one of my main criticisms of the Commission in the digital space is that I tend to think the cases are very narrow, and usually they follow the same pattern, which is, a scenario of vertical leveraging, and that's, in my view, unsatisfactory. Now, I think as a result of these limitations, a lot of the reports that were prepared, at the request of government or were prepared by think tanks, basically said that there's a need for ex-ante legislation. Now, of course, the reason why also the DMA proposal came up is because there's a large consensus, or there's a large coalition of companies that have been pushing for it. I don't think I've seen that larger coalition in my professional life. News publishers have been pushing for it. Small marketplaces that are challenged by the bigger marketplaces such as Amazon or Facebook Marketplace have been pushing for it. AdTech intermediaries, app developers, banks, telecom operators, OTAs, smaller search engines, radio stations, you name it. It's really hard to find an industry that has not been pushing for some form of ex-ante regulation. So that explains why you have this proposal. Now, one thing that is important to clarify from the beginning is that, the DMA proposal is not competition law, and it's in fact intended not to be competition law because it aims at, avoiding some of the shortcomings of competition law. Now, you could say it's part of competition policy, if you define this term broadly, because it deals with competition issues, but certainly it's not part of competition law as we understand it. Now, you see that the DMA proposal is moving away from competition law concepts. For example, when it comes to designation, there's no reference to market definition or dominance. There's no reference in the DMA proposal to consumer welfare. There are references to the competition process and contestability generally, but not the consumer welfare. There doesn't seem to be any space for an effects-based analysis. You've got some attention to distributional aspects, and some people are really emphasizing this reference to fairness, at least in Article 6 of the proposal, although, to be honest, fairness has always been part of competition law, so it's not probably a major distinction between the proposal and competition law. I think where you've got a difference is that, sadly, in my view, the Commission has basically written off Article 102A from the treaty. So although fairness is part of competition, in practice, fairness considerations have been largely ignored or abandoned by the European Commission. Where you have some degree of resemblance between the DMA proposal and competition law is when it comes to enforcement, and in particular, the investigative powers of the European Commission when it aims to enforce the DMA. Does it mean that competition law is dead in digital? Well, I wrote a blog post about it. I think the answer is no. First of all, not all companies are gatekeepers. So definitely there will still be a need to use competition law to deal with, companies that may have a dominant position and yet not be a gatekeeper. The DMA proposal it's possible to update the obligations, but obviously there will always be a time lapse, or maybe when there are novel practices or novel issues of law, well then competition law might be the way because it is very flexible. But then generally I think that if competition law wants to remain digital, relevant in digital, well then it will have to evolve. And I think that unfortunately the Commission has not been sort of showing a great deal of interest of evolving. And when I mean by evolving, I still believe that cases could be run faster and more efficiently. I also believe that there's a need for the use of interim measures more frequently. than it is the case now, and interim measures may be the best survival route for competition law in the digital space. But so I wanted to start by distinguishing very clearly competition law from the DMA proposal, because if you look at the DMA proposal through the lenses of competition law, I think you may have a certain misperception of the proposal. Now, I'd like to focus on three topics that are, of course, very important. The first one is designation. The second one is the content of regulation. And the third one is implementation and enforcement. So when it comes to designation, the Commission identified a number of core platform services. This covers pretty much all platform services you can think about, with some exceptions. For example, browsers are not part of the list. I'm not suggesting they should be, I just note they're not. You've got also some interesting service in the list, and I'm not entirely sure why they're in the list. For example, cloud computing, I don't fully understand why it's part of the list, because all the other services have a sort of intermediation aspect, which is not the case of cloud computing. Cloud computing is not an intermediation service. Provider of cloud computing is not intermediating between anyone. So I find it a bit peculiar to have it in the list, especially also because it seems that it's a market that is contestable. I think that one important aspect also is the future proofness of the list. For example, digital voice assistants are not mentioned in the list of core platform services, whereas I think they will play a great role in the future. Are they covered by intermediation services? I don't know, but I think it's important to look at the list and see whether, you know, the list is over-inclusive or under-inclusive. But that's the starting point. Now, I think that if you listen to the people who've been pushing for the DMA, this broad coalition I've been mentioning earlier, really the focus, they consider that the focus of the DMA should be on the GAFAs, or perhaps the GAFAM, that is the big four or the big five. But of course, that created some challenges for the Commission, because you cannot really say that the proposal should target 4 companies in particular. And also there might be other companies raising challenges. So it seems that the goal was more to capture 10 to 15 companies rather than just 4 or 5. Now, the designation process is not entirely ideal in my view. As you know, you've got a number of qualitative criteria that are mentioned in Article 3.1, but they're presumptively met when a company is a platform or a provider of core platform services, to be more accurate, meets the quantitative criteria that are provided for in Article 3.2. Now, if you look at these quantitative criteria, they essentially capture, you know, size, bigness, right? Because they focus on turnover, market capitalization, the number of users. Now, it doesn't mean that because you're big, you're a gatekeeper. I think these are 2 different concepts. And so I'm a little bit concerned about 2 effects of that designation system, which is one of over-inclusiveness, whereby, you know, you would end up capturing companies or large digital players which do not have a gatekeeper function, right? They just launch. And you can also have a problem of under-inclusiveness, which means that you may have smaller players that exercise a gatekeeping function. Now, of course, the Commission realizes that, and you've got two provisions to deal with it. One is Article 3.4, which could be used to tackle over-inclusiveness, and Article 3.6, which can be used to tackle under-inclusiveness. So I think there are definitely remedies to the problem, but still, I'm not entirely certain that this focus on quantitative criteria is necessarily ideal. I also think that some of the elements in Article, or I do believe that Article 3.6, which comprise the elements that would have to be taken into account, if you use, for example, the exception or the exit route that is found in Article 3.4, are necessarily the good one. As I've mentioned many times, it seems to me that the key element is single homedness versus multi-homing. If you have multi-homing on both sides of a platform, I really don't see how this could be a gatekeeper. I mean, the gatekeeper is basically a company that is an essential gateway. It holds the key to the gate. Now, if you look at OTAs, for example, well, I don't see how any of them is a gatekeeper, because participants on both sides of the platform can deal with each other outside the platform. Hotels can sell their rooms in many different ways, and prospective travelers can book a room in multiple different ways. So I think it is probably better to focus on this notion of multi-homing, looking in particular if you have it on both sides. I think, to me, it is a very relevant criteria. So I think that if you want to perhaps improve a bit the designation process, you've got different ways of doing it. I mean, one would be to make the qualitative and the quantitative criteria in 3.1 and 3.2 cumulative, rather than creating a presumption. Another possibility would be to require that to be captured, a platform provides at least two core platform services to create a bit of a sort of ecosystem requirement. Another possibility, as I mentioned, is to focus more on the notion of multi-homing, which is, a concept that is well understood in the economic and legal literature, and which, in my view, provides a good filter. So that is what I have to say about designation. Now, let me move to the second aspect, which is the content of the regulation, Articles 5 and 6. So it's a pretty extensive list. You've got 18 principles in total, or 18 rules in total. Some have done the exercise of trying to tie these rules to a given competition case, and it's true that most of them, are reminiscent of investigations that were pursued by the Commission a few years ago, or that are still being pursued by the Commission. So definitely, the case law has been the source of inspiration. I think that what the Commission is trying to do is basically to come up with this list of rules in order to generalize some of the outcomes of these competition cases. As I said, these competition cases are quite narrow. If you think about the shopping case, for example, well, it focuses on shopping, and then you've got all the other verticals start screaming, saying, and me, what does it do to me, and to me, and to me? And well, the answer is perhaps in the list, to the extent that the outcome of these decisions are sort of generalized to a broader set of actors rather than to the ones that were directly involved in the case. So it's a sort of response to the narrowness of competition cases. One criticism that is often made against the list that is included, that you can find in Article 5 and 6, is that it's a one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't seem ideal when you have different categories of core platform services providers. And I mean, I tend to sympathize with that criticism. And in fact, the Commission is aware of it, because already in the list of obligations, you see that some of them are really focused on one core platform service in particular. For example, you've got a couple of obligations that are really focusing on online advertising. So obviously, you know, these could not apply and would not apply to any other core platform service. You also see that some of them, perhaps 4 or 5, are really targeting app stores and don't make much sense if you think about a social network or a search engine. So obviously, the Commission, I mean, is aware of the fact that it doesn't make sense to apply exactly the same rules to everyone. But yet, if you read the DMA proposal, you're under the impression that indeed these obligations will apply to all core platform services providers. And that is, in my view, a strange proposition. And I think that if you speak to experts, at least the academic ones, there is sort of consensus that there should be a need for more individualization. So how can you have a higher degree of individualization without necessarily weakening the list in 5 and 6, or basically eviscerating the DMA proposal? I think you can do it in several ways. I mean, I think that there's a bit of a consensus that it might be helpful to keep Article 5 as it is, even if you modify the obligations or, you know, redraft some of them, which is that you've got a sort of blacklist of, you know, practices that would apply to all core platform service providers. But then Article 6 should be more flexible. And I think you can do this in several ways. I mean, one way is to go British, basically, and instead of having specific rules, you may replace them by broader principles. I mean, another way is to have Article 6 more as a sort of menu from which, you know, the Commission could pick and choose. And for example, in the context of the regulatory dialogue, tell an app store, look, you have to implement, you know, A, B, C, E, F, and J, and that's basically it. Another possibility would be to have different list of obligations for different core platform service providers, but that would be a bit complicated conceptually. And another possibility is then to keep it as it is, but then to have a sort of exemption mechanism that wouldn't be limited to the most extreme circumstances, like, you know, the company is going to fall apart, but where in the context of the regulatory dialogue, which is sort of provided for at Article 6, you know, company could basically say, look, I mean, that's all very nice, but this one, you know, it's really focusing on app stores, whereas I'm in fact a search engine. So, you know, could you please confirm that it doesn't apply to me? So I think these are different ways to get to the same result. I mean, each approach has some pros and cons, but I think that it would generally make sense to have a bit more personalization than it is the case in the context of the current proposal. I think that one thing that we see now that the proposal is out is that a lot of, you know, industries or companies want to expand the list of obligations. So, you know, everyone has, you know, a couple of suggestions. Oh, we should add this one or that one. I think it's a bit of a danger. I think in some cases there are merits in considering additions, but you cannot end up with a list of, you know, 35 obligations. And I don't think that the DMA is there to deal with each and every problem that you can identify in the digital sector. I mean, what one should keep in mind that, you know, one of the core themes of the proposal is to address dependencies, you know, the gatekeeper issue, right? So I think that the proposals should be, sorry, the obligation should be focused on addressing that aspect at least. And so I think there's a bit of a danger in sort of trying to put too much under Article 5 and 6. I think that one obligation, I'm not going to discuss all these obligations because it would take the rest of the afternoon, but one that is, in my view, quite important is 5A. 5A, if it were slightly redrafted, could have revolutionary implications, truly. And I mean by 5A, the following obligation, that the core platform service providers should refrain from combining personal data sourced from these core platform services with personal data from any other services offered by the gatekeeper, or with personal data from third-party services, and so on and so forth. So that would basically put an end to the data free-for-all that has very often been criticized, both by competition lawyers, but also privacy experts. Now, this provision has absolutely no value if the last part of that provision is maintained, which is unless the end user has been presented with the specific choice and provided consent in the sense of regulation. I don't know about you, but I always end up giving consent, right? Because if you want to use the service, I mean, you end up giving consent. You really have to spend a lot of time or not use the service at all if you don't give consent, if you don't want to give consent. So I think there's an abuse of consent that should be tackled with. So, I mean, either we keep that provision as it is, and I don't think it will have any impact whatsoever, or you get rid of the last part, and then it would be extremely impactful. So, I mean, I see pros and cons in doing that, right? I mean, I haven't fully figured out yet what would be the, exact impact. But what I'm saying is that this one, if you really want to have one that would be revolutionary, that is the one, much more than anyone else, any other provisions. Now, implementation and enforcement, that is the final part of this short presentation. Well, the process is extremely centralized. It's all in the hands of the European Commission, which has mentioned that it would devote the equivalent of 80 full-time equivalents to do the job. Now, if you've been involved in this like I have, you realize that, it's not enough. I mean, these guys will be completely overwhelmed. I mean, especially, in the first couple of years where a lot of the work will have to be done, these guys will just die on the work and nothing's going to happen. So, I mean, this 80 full-time equivalents is totally unrealistic. Any of the regulated companies will have many more than 80 people working on this, if you include in-house, outside consultants, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, 80 is just insane. And we will end up with the same situation as we have at DG Comp now, is that, people will just be busy and not being able to deliver because they will have insufficient resources. Now, another feature is that there's no complaint process. So you say, okay, there's no complaint process. Is it good or bad? But I think it's extremely bad. It's extremely bad because there will be complaints, but no process. What I mean is that if there's a complaint process, and I think the complaint process should be clearer than it is in competition law, because the fate of complaints is extremely uncertain. Most of them die, and the Commission will never address them. I think there should be a proper complaint process, because if not, what's going to happen is that people will reach informally to the Commission, right? So you will have a sort of hidden complaint process. And I don't like hidden things. I prefer a formal process rather than having, companies, complainants. And I tend to be more often these days on the side of complainants. So, to some extent, I'm kind of, I might, like the fact that it's informal and you can reach out to the commission. No, I prefer a formal complaint process, because then, you know, it is indeed transparent, there are rules. Otherwise, it will be friends calling friends, and that's not ideal in my view. So this is really missing from the proposal. Now, if you think about this degree of centralization, it's actually quite different from what we're accustomed to. If you think about competition law, which is decentralized, which you think about, you know, electronic communication regulation, which is also decentralized. If you think about the GDPR, which is completely decentralized, and of course, there are bad aspects about decentralization, the GDPR being one, where the enforcement process is totally bonkers, if you think about it, and totally inefficient. But at the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that such a degree of centralization is necessarily desirable. In fact, if you look at the member states, their role is minimal. It's basically limited to participating in the Digital Markets Advisory Committee, which means that typically the member states will send, you know, civil servants to attend these meetings where they will opine on a variety of things, but that will be it. And I'm not sure that member states are happy with that. I mean, I can certainly see in big member states such as France or Germany a degree of frustrations about the very small role that is provided to them by the proposal. One of the reasons why I like some degree of decentralization is because it gives more dynamism to enforcement. Very often, my inclination as a complainant would be to go to the commission, and then you go to the commission, they listen to you very politely, and then they will often say, actually 9 times out of 10, well, that's all very interesting, but we have limited resources, we have policy priorities, and therefore, unfortunately, we might not be able to follow up on your complaint, even if they agree that there are merits in the complaint. So basically, you've got another channel, which is to go to national competition authorities, which very often are very keen to listen to you, especially in the digital space, which of course is very exciting. And therefore, you know, if you've got a good claim, if you've got a complaint with merits, well then, very often, you know, you've got a second, basically, bullet to shoot, which is to go to national competition authorities. And we've seen that the big ones, such as France, Germany, but also some smaller ones like the Dutch, of course, the CMA, which is no longer part of the European you know, competition network, but these guys are active, they have resources, many of them have actually invested in competencies such as, for example, you know, data science or computer science. So they seem to be well equipped to deal with the most complex cases. So I would like to see a greater role for them. I'm not exactly sure what can be done about it. So I'm still thinking, and if you have ideas, please let me know, because I'd be very curious. Now, of course, I think that at the same time, there are a number of things that should be kept within the Commission. And there, I like to make a difference between implementation and enforcement. So by implementation, I basically mean, well, designation, the regulatory dialogue, perhaps the updating of the obligations. That is, for me, implementation. And I think it should be done in a centralized way, because otherwise it will create chaos in the internal market, right? On the other hand, if you think about enforcement proper, right? I mean, basically going after gatekeepers that would fail to implement the obligation, I mean, there may be advantages in relying somehow on the national authorities, be they national competition authorities or national regulators. Well, that could be, you know, you could leave that choice to the member state. So there, I mean, I think the proposal could be improved to give or to involve greater resources or better resources in enforcement. One thing that I wanted to mention as well, when you think about implementation and enforcement, is that there's a bit of a tension between due process and effectiveness, right? I mean, obviously, the European Commission is guided by the rule of law, so you cannot, you know, have you cannot. It's not proper to give to the Commission the ability to do whatever it wants without any form of control. At the same time, of course, if you have too many procedures and too much control, well, then nothing gets done. So I think it's an important issue on which one needs to think about very carefully, which is to find a sort of optimal balance between the two. We need speed because speed has been, you know, the main critique, or the lack of speed has been the main criticism made against competition law. So we don't want to fall again into slow processes, but at the same time, we want to make sure that there is some degree of control on what the Commission is capable of doing. So let me just finish up by saying that, you know, I think it's a good text. It's easy to criticize, but when you look at the complexity of the matter, I'm quite impressed by what the Commission managed to deliver. And I think the Commission should be commended for this effort. And I think, you know, it's you know, even if you support the DMA proposal like I do, I don't think it's a bad thing to criticize some aspects of it and to try to improve it. I think some improvement can be made without completely reinventing the wheel and without completely, you know, destroying the proposal. It seems to me that on most cases, some small changes could be made that would make a significant difference. And so when I speak to member states, as I do from time to time, I always say, look, I think to me it's a sound proposal, but I would focus my energy on trying to make limited changes that are meaningful. And there are certainly opportunities to do that. So I will stop here. You've been very patient. Nobody has interrupted me, although I would not have minded. But I'm more than happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Damien.